From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I am Estefania Bravo. This is From the South. Today we start in Honduras, where protesters have set fire to the entrance of the U.S. Embassy, condemning the interventionist attitude of the U.S. government. Riot police and firefighters were deployed to the area as the fire spread. The blaze was, however, eventually put out by firefighters. Protests have been ongoing against President Juan Orlando Hernandez and what demonstrators call his illegitimate and criminal government. This comes as health workers and teachers in Honduras promise to press on with their general strike despite the violence used by the police on Thursday. Our correspondent in Tegucigalpa had exclusive images of a policeman kicking a human rights defender on Thursday. The man was wearing a vest identifying him as part of the ACI human rights organization. The Human Rights Commissioner in Honduras has condemned the violence during the strike against the privatization of health and education. He called on both sides to avoid irreparable damages.
Thousands took to the streets in Tegucigalpa. They spread out across the capital and even reached the airport.
Today the people are in the streets to demand just one thing: the resignation of this narco-dictator and the whole gang of criminals who rule us. We are going to stay in the streets until we get a government of the people.
The repression followed swiftly, pushing protesters into other neighborhoods. It went on for hours.
It's outrageous that the government is repressing us like this. We just want these decrees to be stopped, but they won't listen to us, and this is the only way we can make ourselves heard. Instead of increasing the budget and buying medicines to deal with the crisis, which is what their emergency decree says, they bought in high-quality tear gas and they're firing it at a peaceful demonstration.
The turnout was huge. Many of the protesters held their ground against the police as they used dozens of tear-gassed grenades.
This is an extraordinary show of strength by the people of Honduras, and it shows the weakness of the government. And that means they are in no position to negotiate a solution.
For the protesters, this use of force shows that the government of Juan Orlando Hernandez only survives with the support of the United States and the armed forces.
It's the United States that is keeping this government in place, along with the military high command. For the US, Juan Orlando is just a piece in their game of chess in the region, so that they can use our territory.
The protests took place in all of the main cities in Honduras, and everywhere there was repression, leaving many injured and considerable damage. In spite of the violence used by the government of Juan Orlando Hernandez, the doctors and teachers say they will go ahead with their general strike against the president's refusal to revoke the decrees that will privatize healthcare and education.
Over 1 million people took to the streets of Brazil on Thursday to protest against President Jair Bolsonaro's proposed cuts to education.
Ninguém vai calar o nosso grito!
Fora Bolsonaro!
There were demonstrations in cities across the country. Many of them went on late into the night, like this one in Rio de Janeiro. The government is planning to reduce funding for public education by 30% and is pushing for Congress to pass the cuts in the next 10 days.
In 208 cities across Brazil, over 1 million people took to the streets to protest far-right President Jair Bolsonaro's $1.8 billion cuts to the public education system. The protests, called the Education Tsunami, were organized by students and teacher unions.
The students are out on the streets of Brazil today to say no to Bolsonaro's education cuts. We're not stupid, we're not troublemakers. All we want is quality education.
It was the second national education strike to take place this month. After the first one brought 1 million people to the streets, President Bolsonaro called the protesters idiots. Brazil has one of the world's largest foreign reserves, so these cuts are not necessary for financial purposes, and many people feel that they are a first step towards privatization.
A nation without education is a nation without a future. I am a public school teacher. I studied at public schools, got my master's degree at a public university. I was an affirmative action student, and I know how important education is to people.
The protests were organized nationwide through democratic assemblies of student and teacher unions. Meanwhile, hundreds of other labor unions joined the protests in solidarity with their cause.
We from the CUT understand that the government has taken away workers' rights. Now they are taking away the rights of workers in the education sector. Things have deteriorated a lot. So unity between the workers and the education sector is very important for our country right now.
For the first time in years, the Brazilian labor unions and students have united, and the next step will be a general strike marked for June 14th. Brian Mir, Telesur, São Paulo.
The registration of Venezuelan migrants has begun at 3 locations throughout Trinidad and Tobago as the island opens its doors to its closest neighbors amid the ongoing political situation. Registration would allow Venezuelans, whether legal or not, to stay and work on the island for 1 year. Trinidad and Tobago, in keeping with CARICOM's mandate, maintains its policy of non-intervention in Venezuela's affairs. Our correspondent Kijan Hayes is outside one of the registration venues and has the details.
The government of Trinidad and Tobago has opened its doors to Venezuelans living in Trinidad, whether legally or illegally, who have left from Venezuela as victims of the economic war. This means that they come here to Trinidad and they will be able to register to work for 1 year. This process began this morning just a few hours ago, and hundreds, about 300 Venezuelans came in to register. There are 2 other points in the country, one in San Fernando in the south and one in Tobago. What we understand is once they register, they will be given a receipt and a card that gives them legal status here in the country. This is part of the government's teaming up with the Venezuelan government. They have taken a firm stance of non-interference and non-intervention as the U.S. is trying to oust President Nicolas Maduro. But the government says they are not going to tolerate that and have called for peace between all nations. So the government of Trinidad and Tobago opening its doors now for the migrants who have come across seeking a better life until things get better in Caracas. Reporting from Port of Spain, Kijan Haynes, Telesur.
We thank Kijan Haynes for that report. The head of the Latin American Foundation of Human Rights has criticized the negative impact of the U.S. economic blockade against the people of Venezuela.
For the past 3 years, Funda Latin has denounced the effects of the coercive unilateral measures against Venezuelans. All of them affect the health and the daily life of people in Venezuela. We also know that the Venezuelan state has been implementing a number of social programs with incomes from PDVSA and Citgo.
And members of the Latin American Foundation of Human Rights have also been speaking with Venezuelan nationals who are supposed to receive life-saving medical treatment in Italy. That is, until banks stopped accepting payments from Venezuelan institutions which were funding their treatment. 2 of those patients' lives hang in the balance. They had this to say.
My name is Daisy Olivares and my daughter's name is Lisbeli Molina Olivares. We came here because my daughter has Hodgkin's lymphoma. She was brought here to receive treatment thanks to PDVSA in order to receive her bone marrow transplant, something that can be done in Venezuela. This can save her life. Please put your hand in your heart. Her treatment needs to keep going.
My name is Leomar Gonzalez. I am suffering from chronic myelogenous leukemia. I have had this disease for over 10 years and it has no treatment. That means I urgently need a bone marrow transplant in order to continue living. My message is that please put your hand in your heart. Let's not politicize this. Those of us that suffer from this disease are suffering because of the blockade. Anyone who watches this video, please help us. We depend on PDVSA. They have sponsored our treatment, and as you may understand, this treatment is extremely expensive. Thanks to Venezuela and PDVSA, we are here. But I need to stay here for another year in order to leave.
The Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador says he is confident the U.S. President will rectify his actions and reverse his threat to impose 5% tariffs on all Mexican goods entering the U.S. López Obrador said Mexico does not deserve this treatment. President Donald Trump said he was taking the measure because Mexico wasn't doing enough to curb immigration across the border. He said the tariffs will come into effect on June 10th and will increase by a further 5% every month until, quote, the illegal immigration problem is remedied. Earlier, López Obrador published a letter in which he wrote, President Trump's social problems are not resolved with taxes or coercive measures. How can you turn from one day to the next the country of fraternity with immigrants of the world into a ghetto, a closed space where they are stigmatized, mistreated, persecuted, and expelled? Mexico's Vice Foreign Minister also condemned the threat of tariffs. We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. In 2 weeks' time, Trinidad and Tobago's government and British Petroleum will begin talks on the restructuring of Atlantic LNG, as well as an acceleration of oil exploration on the island. This was among the outcomes of recent energy talks with Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley, held with BP executive at the company's London headquarters. The meeting also came mere days after Trinidad and Tobago signed a new energy deal with oil and gas giant Shell. In the coming days, the governments of Barbados and Antigua and Barbuda are to meet to determine the number of light shares that will change hands. Antigua had offered to buy Barbados' shares in the cash-strapped regional airline. Barbados wants to retain at least 10% of its shares. The airline is owned by 7 Caribbean governments, with Barbados, Antigua and Barbuda, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines being the major shareholders. CARICOM is assuring citizens that it has put measures in place to maintain trade agreements between Caribbean countries and the UK should the UK finally withdraw from the European Union.
Therefore, over the past few months, negotiations have been taking place to roll over, we call it a rollover, meaning therefore that the same trading arrangements that exist within the framework of the EU should be maintained with the UK. Obviously with some small modifications, and that basically has been achieved in that the negotiations have come to a conclusion. Both sides are satisfied with the outcome, and the member states have carried forward, have started signing the agreement.
A plastic ban has been enacted in Tanzania as Africa leads efforts to stem the tide of plastic affecting the planet. The country is banning the import, production, sales, and use of plastic bags. Anyone caught manufacturing or importing plastic bags will be fined with up to $430,000 or face 2 years in imprisonment. Tanzania has become the 34th country in Africa to implement such restrictions.
Once the ban takes effect, the government is not planning on any extensions, and we will not tolerate anyone caught using plastic bags, and this will apply to all, even supermarkets. No plastic bag will be allowed in the country.
Nearly 150 refugees and asylum seekers have been flown from Libya to Italy by the United Nations Refugee Agency. Among those relocated are 65 children. As fighting intensifies in Libya, the UN agency reiterated its call for humanitarian assistance and evacuations in order to bring refugees to safety. Those taken came from Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Somalia. Unrest continues in Algeria as protesters take to the streets for the 14th consecutive week, demanding for the interim government to step down. Despite calls made by the Army Chief of Staff, Gaid Salah, for national dialogue, protesters have vowed to continue mounting pressure on the interim government. Salah has emphasized that the only way to end the crisis is through elections in July. However, no candidates have been nominated. Former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika resigned as president last month after 20 years in power, following weeks of massive street protest.
He said that this regime has to leave and we have to remove it from its roots, all of it. We will continue, not for dialogue or prosthetic solutions. People want real dialogue based on real solutions.
After a 2-year delay, the body of Etienne Tshisekedi, father of the Democratic Republic of Congo's president, is now in his home country. The presidents of Rwanda and Angola were among the thousands gathered at the Kinshasa Stadium to pay their respect to the late political leader. Tshisekedi died in Belgium in February 2017 at the age of 84, but his body stayed there due to conflicts with former President Joseph Kabila. The deadlock ended when his son, Felix Tshisekedi, became president last year. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta has used an historic visit to the Jamia Mosque to call on Muslims to help in the fight against extremism. Kenyatta called for unity in the country and said that the Muslim community should work closely with the government in fighting crime and extremism. There have been several attacks carried out in Kenya by the Somali-based militant group Al-Shabaab in recent years. His office says this was the first time a sitting president visited and prayed at a mosque. In the fourth part of our series, Mozambique, the People Rebuilt, we take a look at the challenges facing the Southeast African nation in its fight against illiteracy and the preservation of the country's many native languages. Andre Vieira has a story.
On March 14, Cyclone Idai hit Mozambique with winds of over 200 kilometers per hour. It left a path of destruction and caused the deaths of over 600 people.
The cyclone blew the roofs of our houses. It destroyed our communities and the fields we worked in.
An important tool for reconstruction efforts is education. While Portuguese is Mozambique's official language, it hardly is the only one spoken. As opposed to Brazil, which was also colonized by the Portuguese, here there are a lot of people who speak native languages. According to UNESCO, Portuguese is the mother tongue of only 10% of Mozambicans.
Here in Chibababa, Sofala, most people speak their mother tongue, their own dialects. Here, most of the population have not been able to go to school.
According to official sources, 90% of the population was illiterate during the 1970s, in the midst of the revolution. Today, according to UNESCO, illiteracy has dropped to 45%. Nonetheless, in rural areas, illiteracy figures stand at 57%, while in urban areas, it stands at 23%.
In Mozambique, women remain at a disadvantage when it comes to education. In urban areas, women can enter public schools, but in rural areas, women can expect to work the fields.
According to the 2017 census, 62% of women and 37% of men are illiterate in Mozambique. But even as Mozambicans face these harsh social realities, they must also push ahead with efforts to reconstruct schools decimated by Cyclone Idai. They are a fighting people who continue looking for ways to move forward.
As a teacher, you never stop facing new challenges, but the main one is using what we have at hand. I have asked my students to bring clay, so we can divide into groups and we can use the clay to create letters, so they can continue learning.
In a country where 90% of the people speak in their native tongues, preserving oral tradition is an important tool in ensuring that culture is also sustained. The successful merging of ancestral knowledge with formal education is one of the main challenges still facing Mozambique.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. 2 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces in separate incidents. In the first instance, police fatally shot a man after he stabbed 2 Israelis in East Jerusalem. The brazen knife attack was captured on CCTV cameras. The assailant can be seen stabbing a man on a bicycle, then targeting another civilian and running after him as his target attempted to flee. Police then intervened and fired at the assailant, killing him. The 2 people were injured in the knife attack, one of them seriously. And in an unrelated incident, a 16-year-old Palestinian boy was shot down by Israeli forces as he tried to enter occupied East Jerusalem to offer Friday prayers at a mosque. Abdullah Loai Gait was from the occupied West Bank city of Hebron. Another Palestinian was wounded and remains hospitalized. A car bomb targeting a U.S. convoy exploded in Afghanistan's capital, killing at least 4 civilians and wounding 4 U.S. service members. An explosives-laden vehicle drove into the convoy that was traveling through eastern Kabul. The Taliban has since claimed responsibility for the blast. It's the second attack in the city in 2 days. On Thursday, the Islamic State claimed a suicide attack outside a military training academy that killed at least 6 people.
8 wounded people were taken to the Wazir Akbar Khan hospital, and 3 of them are in critical condition. The rest are under treatment. I was fixing the car on the street when suddenly the blast occurred, and people told me that your father has been injured. My father had been transferred to a nearby pharmacy to receive first aid, and then we brought him here because he was in a bad condition.
A United Nations expert says Julian Assange has suffered intense psychological torture comparable to some of the gravest cases from interrogation prisons around the world. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer, who accused the US, the UK, and Sweden of consistently failing to protect Assange's human rights. In early May, the UN human rights expert met with Assange in Belmarsh prison and assessed his psychological and mental state along with 2 medical specialists. Melzer says he found Assange to be agitated, under severe stress, and unable to stand trial.
To be very outspoken, I don't believe that he would be, or I wouldn't expect him to be subjected to physical torture in terms of waterboarding or any kind of physical, these so-called enhanced interrogation methods. I would much more expect him to be subjected to prolonged solitary confinement, to very harsh detention conditions, and to a psychological environment which will break him eventually. If he should have committed any offense, by all means he should answer for that. But when we see how these proceedings have been conducted by the Swedish authorities in concerted cooperation with the British authorities, and also indications for cooperation with the United States and now with Ecuador, it is very hard to escape the impression that here we're not speaking of prosecution, but of persecution. That means that judicial power and institutions and proceedings are being deliberately abused for ulterior motives.
And now let's turn to sports. West Indies has hammered Pakistan by 7 wickets to win match 2 of the Cricket World Cup. O'Shane Thomas and Andrew Russell starred as West Indies bowled out Pakistan for 105 and raced to victory with 25.4 overs to spare. Man of the match, O'Shane Thomas took 4 wickets, including that of Pakistan's Wahab Riaz. The Windies' big wins means they overtake England at the top of the standings. And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.